really excited to have you here. It's Sean McDonough. He's every time I think SharePoint development, I think of you. You
I don't know
are
if that's
very
good or
well
bad.
versed. So I'm really excited to have you do this session today because, you know, there's those people where it's like you're kind of the go-to for that topic, and really happy to have you here to go over kind of where we're at today with this topic and give us some information.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad to be here. And I'd like to, for you folks who are listening and watching, my intention when I was initially putting this together, as I explained to Sharon a little bit a few minutes ago, was actually to get a dialogue going. And so I'm going to be watching the chat window. I've deliberately put some questions and some assumptions and thoughts in this presentation, which I'll start here in just a second. But the idea is to get people thinking about perhaps a solution that they've got to build or a business need that is going unaddressed within their organization, and how they might go about doing that. What are some of the key concerns, things like that. But we'll get into that. I also, I feel the need to share my t-shirt first, because with me, t-shirts are a big thing, and this t-shirt is totally me. So, as I will say, tell people I am a lover of all things donut. So let me actually share my screen here so you can stop looking at my mug.
Jonathan bought some donuts that looked just like that the other day. He found donuts that have like raspberry stuff inside of them.
That's cool. I'm sure they were good. I've never met a donut I didn't like. Okay, can you guys see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, so this is Solid Foundations, Building Solutions in an Earthquake-Prone SharePoint Area. And this, it took me a while to arrive at this cover slide. I went through several iterations, both in title and in images I was going to use on the front page. So here are the top 3 most rejected cover images and titles. So starting with number 3, it was title was Questionable Foundations, Building Solid SharePoint Solutions is Anything But a Science. And I'm like, nah, I think that would not inspire confidence. So let's try something else. So we get to number 2, and many people, this is accurate. SharePoint solution creation, it's thought of by many as a plague of biblical proportions. This poor guy's amidst a bunch of locusts, and I'm like, yeah, not the right image. So finally we got to number 1, and this is where I went off the deep end. Lasting SharePoint solutions. The Earth is more likely to suffer a meteor strike, because nothing lasts with SharePoint. And as we will see when we get into talking about development techniques, there's always I'll say a flavor du jour, although that's longer than a day. Microsoft has this habit of changing things up on us after they said, this will be the final release of anything. We're not going to change our approach. We're going with this for a while. And then they change it. So a little bit about me. My name is Sean McDonough. I'm a consultant with Bitstream Foundry. Just hit my 5th year as a Microsoft MVP. I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio, so a little ways off from you folks. Although I've been to Kansas City for at least one SharePoint Saturday a number of years back. I've been working with SharePoint fairly exclusively since 2004. It seems like most of the things I've done since then have revolved around SharePoint. Occasionally I take diversions off into Office 365 and other workloads, but invariably I come back to SharePoint development, and lately a lot of PowerShell scripting, some of which have been showing up on my blog. I have an awesome wife named Tracy, and I have 2 8th grade twins, Brendan and Sabrina. I don't know how they got to be in 8th grade already. I'm sure most parents feel that way. I'm an electronic music aficionado, and if you go to bunkertunage.com, you'll see mixes that I've been putting together around the holidays for the last 20 years. I make those available. I'm an AR/VR junkie, an avid video gamer in general. I got quite by accident, I got back into Magic the Gathering a number of months back. A friend of mine, his young son, was interested in it. And so it ended up pulling me back in. So I pulled all my cards out from 25 years ago and discovered that I've got quite a nest egg. As my son says, "You could retire, Dad." I'm like, I don't quite think it's that much money, but it's not bad. And like I said, a lover of all things donut. So I can't complain about donuts. Anybody who knows me in the community knows that if they show up with donuts, they'll have a very happy Sean. So let's get back to the target of today's presentation. I want to, and first I'll ask the question, does anybody know what I'm showing on the screen right now?
Disc golf.
Frisbee golf.
Hey.
Yes.
Hey,
We
very
have a
good.
ton of that here.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. That's
cool. Actually, Frisbee golf, I used to work with a guy who was a semi-competitive Frisbee golfer. And the university where I went, Miami University in Ohio, half of the campus was a Frisbee golf course, one that, semi-professionals and pros would play every now and then. So that was my introduction to it. But today we're going to be talking about SharePoint's app options over the year, because we've had a number of different techniques available to us for creating applications, some available to developers, some oriented more towards citizen developers or pro users. There are certain key decision points and criteria to think about when we're building a solution in SharePoint. Some of them are obvious. Some of them, they don't really come into play until you really understand SharePoint's goal and what it has evolved from. We'll talk about an overview. We'll do an overview of options that are currently what I consider viable for solutions. And a couple of them may surprise you, but we've also got some corner cases. And I got a few pointers on how to avoid painting yourself into a corner with a solution approach, because as a guy who backed Microsoft Silverlight, I can tell you all about backing dead technologies and where that gets you, or technologies that eventually die. So any questions about that? Sound good? Okay. I'm going to take silence as acceptance or acquiescence, maybe. Go forward. Oh, I know what I got to do. It's the problem of moving things around on my screen. My clicker loses its focus. There we go. So our options for development over the years, and this is where we, look at the past and that nice glow that it has. Problem is with SharePoint, that glow might be being emitted from radiation because many of these techniques are no longer popular. So back in the SharePoint Portal Server 2003 days and Windows SharePoint Services version 2, which was the free version, power users had one option available to them. That was pretty much front page 2003. And if you had front page, you could do all sorts of changes to SharePoint sites. And in many cases, quite a bit of damage. Developers had one option, and that was compiled code running on the server. Anybody who developed for SharePoint back in the 2003 days knows that the only real developer assistance you got came in the form of packaging up your code as a Microsoft solution package. That's what the Orca executable does, and still does, or did back then, still does now. Orca is and was part of the software development kit for Windows, and it's a way to edit the tables that end up being built to drive solution installation. And this is solution when I say solution in this case, I mean the MSI file. So all of our compiled code, we were building DLLs and assemblies that ran directly against the SharePoint server object model. That was the only form of development we had. Then came MOS 2007, or Microsoft changed the name because everybody was getting wise. So we had Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007 and Windows SharePoint Services version 3. Developers, well, rather, let's start with power users. SharePoint Designer 2007 is what evolved out of Front Page 2003. Christian Buckley and I were just having a discussion about this on our community office hours, and we have a disagreement on the lineage of this, but we agree that Front Page 2003 yielded SharePoint Designer 2007, or as I like to call it, SharePoint Destroyer, because that's oftentimes a more accurate reflection of what it does to sites for those who aren't careful with their changes. But also, this is the time frame when Windows or Microsoft was introducing Workflow Foundation, WF. We are also getting the initial precursors to Windows Communication Foundation and Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF, WCF. And of course, InfoPath. Everybody knows that InfoPath is not a good thing to use nowadays, and has been deprecated and slated for death by Microsoft for quite a while. Developers, this is actually where we got a little bit of support for building features and solutions. Now, the feature and solution framework came with MOS 2007, so we could deploy things more reliably within the farm environment. But the problem was any support for developers themselves in terms of building these solutions had to come from the community. They were not built into any tooling that developers had available to them. So anyone who developed for SharePoint in these days remembers Wisp Builder. That was one of the community projects that was put together to help developers package solutions up into a WSP, a web solution package. We had access to SOAP-based web services, and that existed for some time, but it actually kind of rose to notoriety with this guy here, Mark Anderson. He created a little old library called SP Services. SP Services continues to exist to this day, and it still works much the way it has in the past, and runs against SharePoint Online as well. Now, that's both good and bad. We can talk about some performance quirks with it. Mark and I have had a number of conversations about this, and he agrees that certain things in SP Services should not be used anymore, but like many developers, if you have something that works, you tend to use it until you're told not to or it breaks. So some developers need some help with that, but SP Services still works. And this library is what made it possible for legions of developers to build client-side and JavaScript-based solutions using SharePoint, both SharePoint as a presentation and application mechanism, but also third-party, external to SharePoint, and consuming SharePoint as maybe a data store or just a set of related services. So that's what we got with 2007. Now with 2010, things actually got better. Power users pretty much had the same set of tools that they had previously. And the workflow-based options, this is where a lot of third-party workflow kits and tools got integrated into the platform, ideas for them anyway. Developers, we finally from Microsoft got Visual Studio support for these features and solutions we had been building for now years as kind of individual pieces of code and XML snippets that were being stitched together through Wisp Builder. Microsoft formalized it within Visual Studio. And this is also where we saw some extensions to the web services that SharePoint used. We, of course, had the SOAP-based web services that were present around the time Microsoft introduced SharePoint 2003. But also, we were starting to get some WCF, Windows Communication Foundation web services, in addition to what the SOAP-based web services did. Now, the WCF, Windows Communication Foundation web services weren't as extensive as the legacy web services, because the SOAP-based web services were written around the .NET 1.0 phase. They were still the ASMX endpoints that you would call and pass everything back and forth as SOAP XML, which is what SP services simplified for many developers. But WCF had its own calling conventions and did things differently. This is also the point at which Microsoft introduced formal PowerShell support for SharePoint. Prior to SharePoint Server 2010, you could indeed use PowerShell. In fact, I wrote many deployment scripts for MOS 2007, but in order to use PowerShell with SharePoint at that point, you had to be well-versed in the .NET framework because you did not have commandlets built specifically for SharePoint. So you had to do everything the .NET way, which many developers were comfortable with, not so much admins. And after the 2010 timeframes, we got to a bit of tectonic shifting. The world changed for SharePoint around the 2013 timeframe. And I remember the time it shifted for me, and I started to question lots of different things. So SharePoint 2013 and beyond is where Microsoft made a foundational shift in thought and mentality on how SharePoint should be used, as well as extended or, if you will, customized. SharePoint 2013 is where Microsoft introduced its cloud app model. There were 3 different variants at that point. One was SharePoint hosted apps, the other was a provider hosted application framework, and the third, which you don't hear about anymore because it never got commercialized, is called auto hosted, which involved framework and plumbing to deploy SharePoint solutions into Azure to run. The problem is nobody could figure out the right way to monetize it. Should the person writing the solution have to pay for every deployment of it? Should an organization that maybe installs a free solution then get charged Azure time for the solution's back end? Microsoft couldn't figure that out, and so auto-hosted faded from the scene. Then we were left with SharePoint hosted and provider hosted, which we will spend some time talking about. But let's start first with power users, what they got. They still had SharePoint Designer, as well as InfoPath, SharePoint 2010 style workflows. But we also got a new workflow engine with SharePoint 2013, and that was based on the Azure Workflow Manager. SharePoint 2010 style workflows, it's worth noting, besides the fact that they're going away November 1st, so if you are using a 2010 style workflow, or you're not sure if you're using, you may want to go out to Microsoft and get either the SharePoint Migration Assessment Toolkit or the SharePoint Modernization Scanner and have a look. Those tools can assess your site for 2010 style workflows and return where they are and whether or not they're candidates and how well they might map to something like Power Automate, formerly known as Flow. Of course, we get Flow and Power Automate. We get Power Apps. So we get new capabilities that are cloud-based. Now, that doesn't mean they have to run only in the cloud in some cases, but these are things that were being put together with Microsoft's new version for things in mind, and that was cloud first. Microsoft announced it was cloud first around this time frame, and all of its development was going to be focused in SharePoint Online and backported or adapted for SharePoint on premises. So on premises SharePoint became second fiddle and SharePoint Online stepped up. Many different organizations didn't know how they felt about that. As a developer in this time frame, I can tell you, as one of a couple hundred people who went to Redmond around the time of the SharePoint 2013 pre-release, those of us who went to Redmond we were all from different ISVs, independent software vendors. I was working for Idera at the time. We were invited to Redmond. We thought we were getting a 1-week briefing on SharePoint 2013 and what was coming out. What we were actually getting a briefing on was the new SharePoint development model, which was the cloud app model. I can tell you, in a room of a couple hundred people, you had never, I would say, heard it so quiet. There was an utter lack of sound when the presenter on stage said, "You will no longer write full trust solutions. Everything you want to run in SharePoint is now going to run on a different server." And you could hear a pin drop because every ISV in that room was thinking, am I no longer relevant in the SharePoint development game? I worked for a company that was primarily building tools to help administrators and infrastructure people managing SharePoint, and telling me that I couldn't run our code on servers that were SharePoint servers basically made 80% of the products irrelevant from 2013 on. And at that point, that's when a lot of different ISVs got out of the SharePoint business. That's the time and when Acceler was bought by Metalogix, Idera sold its SharePoint products to Metalogix. So you saw a lot of consolidation in that frame of time. And the reason for that is, in many reasons, there are different reasons for it, but largely driven by that change to the app model, which we will talk about. So developers, in the 2013 timeframe, and this goes beyond 2013. This has been, this cloud app model being introduced in 2013 is still relevant today, which is good because with the way things changed in Microsoft, like I was saying, we get different development approaches that become advocated. It's nice to see Microsoft sticking to at least a consistent ideology, if not a consistent set of tools. So we still have full trust solutions, which they haven't gone anywhere. They still exist. We've got the cloud app model, and we've got SharePoint hosted add-ins and provider hosted add-ins. SharePoint hosted add-ins are basically JavaScript based applets, or I'll call them add-ins, since technically Microsoft went from apps to add-ins from 2013 to 2016. So they're technically called add-ins now, but a SharePoint hosted add-in is some JavaScript, CSS, HTML that's bundled up, deployed to a subweb within a SharePoint Online site. And that application is driven entirely by JavaScript. It's kind of a lightweight deployment model. It's limited in what it can do. The provider hosted app model, or add-in model, on the other hand, is an approach that is very similar in nature to Facebook's approach to extending Facebook with applications. And this is the idea that applications run on another server. They treat SharePoint as a set of web services, communicate with SharePoint, and in most cases have a privileged relationship with the SharePoint servers for things like authentication and validation of users. But the apps run on entirely different servers, and there's a reason for that, which we'll get into. We still have the same old SOAP and WCF-based web services, but starting with 2013, Microsoft's evolved a set of RESTful web services, REST being representational state transfer. REST web services are common on the internet, and they're common among different web-based application programming interfaces. And so SharePoint was actually starting to get with the times. We got the client-side object model, which are typically a set of libraries, either JavaScript or .NET, that make it easy for us to work with SharePoint as a set of web services. There was an intention by Microsoft to deploy a Java CSOM library as well. And I think it might have for a brief time, but when I went looking for some details on that, when I was putting this presentation together, I could find absolutely no trace of it. So I think that one kind of faded away, but Java developers can consume SharePoint RESTful web services and other web services as they might have before. Now, starting with SharePoint 2016, certainly with SharePoint Online and in SharePoint 2019, we get support for the SharePoint framework. And this is a modern set of JavaScript libraries that's built with modern tool stacks. We're using things like Node.js, different editors, different frameworks like React, Yeoman, which is a solution generator. It's a modern tool stack rather than something that must be built in Visual Studio, which is the old methodology of building solutions in SharePoint. And of course, we still have PowerShell. So developers have a whole host of options available to them, which are still valid and work. But if you are somebody who has to decide on an approach and you have not been keeping up with this, you might blow your stack. You'd probably be depressed. It's understandable. And that's kind of, why I'm doing this talk today, is to, share where things have gone, where I think they're going, what works now, and, help you perhaps rule in or out maybe an approach you're thinking about taking, or, just anything that might help you decide on a direction for your next solution. So this is a point where we step into what I call key decision points and criteria. So some directional platform consideration. Now, probably the single biggest question that one must ask themselves when they're building a solution nowadays is this going to be on premises? Is it going to live in the cloud, or both? Or is it going to be a hybrid solution? Like I said, single biggest decision factor. Are you trying to address SharePoint and have your solution running in the cloud? Are you going to run an on-premises farm and build your solution? Is there a chance that you might migrate once you actually build the solution? And we'll talk about that a little bit. But some design options are only available on premises and others are only available in the cloud. Full trust solutions, for instance, remain the big, heavy way of building modifications and customizations in SharePoint. Most of what people build in SharePoint or customize in SharePoint doesn't need that heavy-handed approach anymore. But oftentimes, developers will go, like I said, with what they know because it's what they've always developed in or used. And so it sometimes is painful to consider something other than a full trust solution. Not everyone's comfortable with JavaScript. Not everyone's comfortable with the modern tool frameworks that we've got now. So, depending on the age of your development crew, if you have a development team, that may play into things, and we'll reference that a little bit more in a while. Now, it's also worth pointing out that cloud doesn't necessarily mean SharePoint Online, Microsoft's offering. There are other ways to be in the cloud. You could build a dedicated farm in Azure virtual machines, and some organizations have done that to get them to a cloud-like environment where they get redundancy and they gain some of the benefits of the cloud without some of the pain, because if you build your environment as Azure virtual machines, you're not sharing hardware with anyone in a tenant. And some organizations, that's ideal. Maybe they've got security concerns. There are reasons for using a cloud other than Microsoft, but in the majority of cases, like I say here, going to the cloud means for most people going to SharePoint Online, and I'd venture to say that most of us in this presentation have some SharePoint Online experience or are in SharePoint Online ourselves. The numbers are starting to tip, I think, pretty heavily in favor of SharePoint Online, but there are some people who still need to run on-prem for various reasons. So some other considerations we need to factor in, and I'm not going to be able to hit all of these in terms of, I will obviously miss somebody's key decision point or what they think is their key decision point, but I'm going to go through these as I thought about them. So next question, will you remain on that SharePoint platform for the life of the solution? And what I mean by this question is, are you looking to build the type of solution to address a business need that is going to remain for a very long time and likely extend beyond the duration of the version of SharePoint you're on, assuming you're on premises? If you're in the cloud, the version of SharePoint isn't quite so clear because the cloud typically gets new content on 2-week intervals, depending on your tenant and your release cycle. But if you're building something on-prem, what is the expected and realistic lifetime of that solution? Are you trying to fill a hole and stop a gap in a short-term sort of way? Are you building something that's going to last for a very long period of time? And so if you think you might be lasting, the need you're addressing goes on for a very long time, will your solution need to migrate from on-prem to the cloud at some point? Migration is a very big set of concerns, and migrations are still going on. I know there was forecasting that migrations would start to tail off. I've seen none of migrations tailing off, and I'm sure many of you who work in services are probably doing just as many migrations as we are. But migrations become a big decision point because depending on your solution technology, you may or may not be able to take that solution in its current form to the cloud. We already talked about full trust code not going to the cloud or not going to SharePoint Online. That is one of the things that sometimes forces people into an alternate environment where they can run that code. I believe FP Web, for instance, used to offer a SharePoint environment in the cloud, and I think even Rackspace did this, where you could install some solutions provided they went through some prior validation by the folks who had to operate those environments. But SharePoint Online, there is no ability to run full trust code. Of course, on-prem, you can do whatever you want. So if you're going to build a solution and you want to be forward thinking and cloud compatible, you're not going to pick the full trust approach. You're going to go with something else. And then there's the question, of course, of SharePoint upgrades, because even though Microsoft says, oh, you can go from version to version of SharePoint, they kind of gloss over all of the really important details, like how you've got to upgrade content databases, how the version of .NET under the hood typically switches, how solutions have to be rebuilt and recompiled at a minimum. But I have never had a full trust solution just migrate as is from one version of SharePoint to another. It's the stuff of dreams, I guess. Maybe some of you have, and which I say count your lucky stars, because that is not the normal upgrade scenario. So if you're going to upgrade, that's almost certainly going to force you to think a little bit differently about your solutions, how much you invest in them, and the approach you take to building them. So another consideration, and this is a big one, and this is where for many of us, our business systems and other sources of data come into play. What are the interfaces and where are the interfaces for the systems that are going to be used? And this is systems that SharePoint reaches out to and touches. Now, maybe it's directly through web service calls. Maybe it's indirectly through something like a business connectivity services or an InfoPath form. Yes, I said the I word. I'm not advocating for InfoPath. There are other solutions. Don't use InfoPath. And if you need a reminder of that, just search for Mark Rackley's video on Say No to InfoPath. It ought to compel you not to use InfoPath. But we need to think about the solutions that we're going to be interacting with. And oftentimes this is where we start thinking very specifically about our application architecture. For instance, if we build a cloud solution and the systems we need to interact with are on premises, are we going to build our solution to adapt for that? Or are we going to use a connector? What are our options? And it's worth noting that, you know, a hybrid SharePoint farm, one that exists both on-prem and in the cloud, is a possibility. BCS connectors can go back on-prem into the cloud between environments. But oftentimes, if we're writing custom code, it's got to be specifically engineered to handle those things and those situations gracefully, I guess I should say. And I see that Todd Kolstrom says I've had some full trust solutions migrate without changes from 2013 to 2016, but they weren't terribly complex. And the code is pretty straightforward. Yeah, 2013 to 2016, I could see your 2016 to 2019. And if they're not complex, if they're, you know, like CSS changes or deploying declarative assets and whatnot, those are the kinds that would go pretty painlessly. And maybe some lightweight .NET code, but people writing, you know, workflow extensions and things like that. The old developer mindset of, you know, SharePoint is a platform, I need to extend it. That mindset is the one that often hurts the most. So anyway, back to interfaces. We are talking, you know, if you're going to be bridging systems and bridging cloud and on-prem, you need to think about how your solution is going to handle that if there are not extenders and tools that will make that easy for you. Now, the interesting thing is the third-party market has begun to recognize this need and is developing. There have been tools, development tools for SharePoint that provide libraries to make it easy to go between environments. But I think we're actually starting to see some third-party packages that are more than just development kits and whatnot. So this need will probably continue to arise as long as people need to go back and forth between the cloud and on-prem. So let's talk about some technical considerations. And it's not the things I was just talking about aren't technical. They tend to be more architectural, what I was talking about. Technical considerations are very specific technical points that stand out in our consideration. And so I say, you know, one of those is what sort of user interface or user experience, the UI, UX is needed. So certain solution capabilities and certain solution approaches have, and in fact, most of them have the ability to generate some sort of UI. But does your solution even require a UI? There are many solutions that run akin to background processing that don't really have a user interface component to them. They might have a configuration page in central administration, or they may have some PowerShell commandlets that they use to configure the service, so to speak, but they might not have an interface. But for most of the solutions we think about when we're talking about SharePoint, oftentimes have a UI because SharePoint provides that UI for us in most cases. So are there specific capabilities that we need to be present in our UI? You know, some level of rich interactivity. Now, granted, you can do a lot with React and JavaScript nowadays. JavaScript has come a long way. I've got a book. I'm not going to go pull it off the shelf, but the first JavaScript book I had was from Rocks, and it had, you know, like a cartoon puppet being dangled, and it was that basically described JavaScript at the time, changing colors, making things flash. Nobody built serious applications in JavaScript. Nowadays, there are some very, very serious applications built in JavaScript. SharePoint framework is JavaScript. We have entire frameworks and systems built into SharePoint to support JavaScript. It's come a very, very long way. But JavaScript does have certain limitations in what it can do. And Windows controls compiled code. There are some things it can do beyond what the JavaScript controls and techniques can do. We're getting closer and closer to parity, but I don't think we're ever going to see true parity between JavaScript based controls and compiled code based controls that may be built in WPF. A lot of that has to do with background plumbing, eventing mechanisms, things like that. So you need to understand what your user interface is going to have to provide for users. Does your application need to do any heavy processing or CPU intensive operations? If it does, well, then we need to think, okay, I'm going to have this beefy application that sucks CPU cycles. Where am I going to run this? Am I going to build a full trust solution that runs on a SharePoint server and perhaps slows it down? Am I going to build it on an application server somewhere where I might have to pay the cost of CPU cycles like in Azure? Am I going to try and run this on the user's workstation, which nowadays most user workstations have got enough power to do the processing of 100 mainframes ages ago. I mean, the system I just built that I'm running right now, a bit of a humble brag, but I've got, it's a 32 core Threadripper. I have 64 hyperthreads of processing. And for the AV work I do, as well as running virtual machines, that does wonderful things for me. And if I had to build a solution that was client side, that solution would have all sorts of resources available to it. This is a situation we didn't have a decade or two ago when people, when browsers were really pushing their limits, the idea of keeping 10, 15 Chrome windows open at a time, or I know some of you, 50 Chrome windows open at a time, 50 Chrome tabs. Yeah, what we do nowadays is just, it would make people astounded if they could see into the future 20 years ago. But, that's what we've got at our disposal. And all of this comes down to the last point, which is, are your UX and UI requirements clear? Do you understand what the users are going to need in order to make this thing run? Are they going to expect a rich interface? Is it just an admin interface where I need to configure things? Can I get away with less? That might help drive your decision whether you do this based in JavaScript or some other technology. Just a point of consideration. I know it's not the whole chalupa, but it's one to consider. Another consideration, and this is a very important one that many of us overlook. Does your application need to be able to act as someone other than the current user? Impersonation, the idea of impersonating a user, does not typically come with browser-based applications. And if it does, it's typically not provided by the browser. It's provided through some other server-side component where true impersonation can be done. Fact of the matter is, a browser runs in the context of the current user on the system. Now, I know you can change things up a little bit with Google Chrome profiles, but I'm talking universally, browser actions are limited to the current context, and important, they're limited to interactive sessions, meaning if I've got an application that needs to do anything administratively, first of all, a browser-based application, it's not going to be able to do that unless it somehow runs as me. So there's no background processing that can happen after I've logged off my computer. And second, this app-only context that exists with some application models is not going to be present in my browser-based JavaScript application. So this is where we get into provider-hosted apps with SharePoint. We'll talk a little bit, again, more about that, but provider-hosted applications give us the capability to act as someone else, even if it's the application itself, so that it might conduct privileged operations, typically things like cleanup or sorting or external nightly runs of some sort. The sorts of privileged background processing you don't want to give to users, but you need the system to do. That's the type of impersonation that's most important in all of this, but the ability to act as someone else. And this is why, if you are familiar with it, SharePoint, back in the 2003, 2007 days, SharePoint had the ability to change users directly from within the browser interface. You notice that doesn't exist anymore because the technique it used to do that was a bit of a hack. But I work with different JavaScript frameworks like Akumina and build intranets based on Akumina. And many people ask, well, I want to post as someone else. I'm like, you can't do that. You can get 90% of the way there. You can make it sort of look like it came from that person, but you cannot, as for instance, a secretary or an admin assistant, act as your boss or the marketing director when you post something without logging in as that person. So no impersonation for anything that's truly and firmly based in the browser. Other technical considerations: does your solution need to persist or store data in some way? The answer to this is almost overwhelmingly yes, unless you've got a platform that's engineered specifically not to persist data. I said I work with Akumina. Akumina is a digital workplace solution framework, and their platform is built specifically so that it does not persist itself any sort of data. And this is what allows it to be certified in certain environments. Any persistence and any data that it uses exists in SharePoint rather than another application storage layer. And you may have something that runs on SharePoint that also operates that way, so you don't need to worry about persisting data. But if you are thinking about persisting data, what sort of security needs do you have around that data? Could that be very extreme security, in which case a browser-based application would probably need some other component to it to store data, because browsers typically do not store data in a way that we think of as particularly secure. We can typically store in remote storage. We can do it in local storage, but remote to the application or the site. We can store in cookies. We can store, if a user gives permission, in a file, but none of that, tends to have any encryption built in or any data security. What about data sovereignty? And this is more so for EU companies, but certain countries say that data can't be stored outside of the geographic boundaries of the country the system is running in. Well, if that's the case, do you try to persist data in a browser if you can't guarantee that it's only running in the country? Oftentimes, the application or the data sovereignty requirements won't let you even build that kind of application, or it will fail an audit. But these are things you need to think about. So different approaches to solution building drive some of these, or rather they address some of these requirements more so than others. Now, this is a favorite one of mine, and pardon me for stepping up on a soapbox for a second. Yes, I'm the one who wrote not SQL across that entity diagram on the right. Does your application have a need to work with relational data? So this is truly relational data in the database sense. Do you need referential integrity, maybe triggers, constraints? You have specific data type definitions. SharePoint is not a relational database management system, and it has never been one. I've written many applications over the years. Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I've written applications. I've been called in to architect applications, and I've been shown the door again because I said, don't build it on SharePoint. You do not want to build this on SharePoint. But many organizations, it's less so these days, but organizations who had paid for SharePoint, they bought a big hammer, and that big hammer cost a lot of money. They wanted to see everything as a nail, and there was a period of time when everybody was building everything on SharePoint, whether or not it should be built on SharePoint. SharePoint has things like lookup columns. These are poor replacements for true referential integrity and primary key foreign key relationships. Lookup columns can get you some of that flavor, but if you need truly relational data stores, you're not going to store that data in SharePoint. You shouldn't. It's easy to think of a SharePoint list as kind of like a flat data table, but really, it's not the same thing. Yes, SQL powers, yeah, not to mention the join limitations. Yeah, with lookups and other data. You can't get that in SharePoint. And so just don't try. If you need relational data stores, I will say this. You can still put SharePoint on the front end if you want, but you're probably going to have a data persistence layer or data persistence factory, and you'll implement that, and it'll happen somewhere else on an Oracle, SQL, NoSQL, whatever database backend you've got. Maybe it's a cloud backend, but you will not bring that to SharePoint. And you sometimes get into battle with people over this. I'm glad that's been your view too, Brad. Sounds like more than a few of you have heard this one before, maybe even lived it. And if you've lived it, my heart goes out to you because I've been there too. So there's some other considerations, and I figured we would be getting roughly to some point about now. There are other considerations, and if you guys feel that I missed something glaring, and I can easily see myself doing that, go ahead and share something in the chat window. Feel free to write me afterwards. I'll have my contact information there. But there are tons of different factors and consideration points that you put in when trying to envision and design a solution that interacts with SharePoint or uses SharePoint in some way. And you can never really point to one factor. And that's the point of this whole thing. There's no single magic answer to building solutions with SharePoint. You have probably heard anybody who consults in SharePoint say it depends, with sort of a tongue-in-cheek idea. Each of the items and concerns we've discussed so far inform the ultimate approach we take. And in my experience, there are very few hard blockers and absolutely not circumstances. For instance, you absolutely would not do X, Y, Z. Because the minute you say absolutely not or yes positively, somebody comes along and proves you wrong. So that's why we commonly say it depends. Much of what I'm going to share and my thoughts on it should be considered as directional guidance. It's merely to get the creative juices flowing and perhaps give you some things to research. I have got pages of references at the end that deal with all of the different topics I'm talking about, because I very much expect if you're, in the process of solutioning, then you should gather as much information as you can to make the best decisions. So, full trust solutions. We've all heard don't build full trust solutions. By and large, that's pretty accurate. There are a few exceptions, but the days of full trust compiled solutions in SharePoint are behind us. They don't go to SharePoint Online or most clouds. They're, not required to impersonate users or actually run with an app-only identity any longer. So these are the classic SharePoint timer jobs that people held up for a while saying, I need a full trust solution for the timer job. Believe it or not, no, you don't anymore. That pattern has been addressed with provider-hosted apps. Full trust solutions mostly developed a bad name through devs. I'll admit, devs writing code that had unintended negative effects on SharePoint farms. And this was the situation. The developer would write something, deploy it, And when everything broke on Saturday, it's the admin they called, not the developer. And admins kind of hated that, understandably so. They were catching flack for everything that went wrong in the environment. Well, it's slow. Well, what that admin maybe didn't know was that the solution that had just been deployed was doing some horrible things and wasting CPU cycles. So full trust solutions got thrown off the server. It was the right direction for going forward, but developers, I think, had a hand in that. Now, are there cases when you might not want to completely rule out full trust solutions? I have to grudgingly say yes. If you know for a fact you're not going to be migrating to the cloud in the application's lifetime, if you're adapting an existing full trust solution for on-premises use, and again, see that first bullet here, and you know you're not going to the cloud, if your development team is seriously behind on the tech curve, and don't laugh at this, I've worked with at least one organization that the developers were still in the mindset of SharePoint 2010 full trust deployment. They were trying to upgrade to a 2016 farm, but they knew nothing about the cloud app model. They knew nothing of SharePoint development after the 2010 timeframe. Those developers were not ready to adopt a cloud app model, JavaScript-based applications, anything like that. So if your development team is seriously behind, there's going to be a lot of gear stripping, and I will say it's going to take some time to learn new capabilities. I come from a compiled code background. I kicked and screamed when I had to learn JavaScript because I didn't want to do it. I ultimately did it a little bit at a time, and over a time frame, I got comfortable with it. I still write compiled code a lot, but the bulk of what I'm writing for SharePoint is JavaScript in some form. That doesn't happen overnight. And if you are truly building something that can be built only with full trust code, and these are going to be a case by case basis. It's hard to make a case for full trust solutions anymore, just because they have a known end of life if anybody's going to the cloud. We don't know that we're going to have support for the indeterminate future. We have support now, and Microsoft's not looking to change that object model that's exposed from the server. But these are things to bear in mind. And like I said, I don't like to rule anything out inappropriately or out of hand. Everything has a purpose, a place and a purpose. And there is still use and use cases for full trust solutions. There are just many fewer these days. So some thoughts on that. Of course, the alternatives, Microsoft doesn't push us out of a plane without a functioning parachute. And provider hosted add-ins get us 95 to 98% of what we get with full trust solutions of previous days. We can treat SharePoint as a web service. So a provider hosted application, for those, just to reiterate, it is an application that runs on its own application server. And so it is not running on SharePoint farm. Provider hosted apps can be built in any language. There is no requirement that .NET be used. You can build a Java PHA. You can build JavaScript if you're running Node.js. You want to build a Python PHA? Go for it. You treat SharePoint as a set of web services. Now that application server typically has a privileged relationship with the SharePoint farm. Typically, if you're on premises trying to run provider hosted applications or add-ins, you're setting up what's called server to server high trust, where your app server and your SharePoint server swap certificates, and so they can establish a privileged channel communication. If you're out on the web and running in SharePoint Online or another brokered scenario, typically you will use OAuth 2.0. And Azure Active Directory becomes your most common point of authentication. Because what SharePoint, when it's running a provider-hosted application, SharePoint trusts the referring system to authenticate the user. SharePoint still does its own authorization, so saying what permissions you have to do what. But the part about validating your identity, authentication, either has to come from an application server and a server-to-server high trust relationship, or it needs to come from OAuth in the online scenario, typically with Azure Active Directory as the validating party. That's the way it works. And that's what allows a provider hosted application also to impersonate another user, because it says to the SharePoint server, hey, I'm Bob Jones. Well, I know my name's Sean McDonough, but the app running as me can say it's Bob Jones. Since the SharePoint server trusts the PHA, it's going to say, okay, Bob Jones, what do you want to do? That's how it does impersonation, and also how it acts as its own application. It can pass in another ID. Take care, Rose. It can pass in another ID that is specific to the application and say, I want to run as this application, and SharePoint will trust it as that. So PHAs can do a lot. Nice thing too is, since it's running on another application server, you're free to set up any sort of cron job, package it as a Windows service, set up a timer or a task-based recurring task to run some code. And that's how it can run non-interactively. So PHAs truly end up with most of the capabilities of a SharePoint full trust application. And there are different patterns to using PHAs. And I've got a number of references at the end of this presentation, which we're getting close to. So the client-side push. It should be clear by now that Microsoft's made no secret of it, development and customization was best done somewhere other than the SharePoint farm. That was a determination made in the 2013 timeframe, and all of the capabilities we've been getting since 2013 have been oriented around some sort of JavaScript integration and more powerful, capable JavaScript patterns and modes of interaction. Now, many of these are very exciting, particularly for full stack web developers and folks not familiar with SharePoint, because one of the compelling pieces in going to this kind of tooling and framework, especially with the SharePoint framework, was the idea that you can pull in developers in current modern web technologies. So folks who are maybe used to pulling packages from GitHub, Node Packet Manager for the version of Node they're using, NPM, NVM if you're managing the version of the possibilities go. The stack, there are so many components. It's crazy, and it all just kind of works, but it, like everything else with this, it takes some time to learn. And so this is unfamiliar to many older SharePoint developers. So, if, as much as I can say, be sensitive to the human part of this, developers may not be up to speed on JavaScript development techniques. So, like I said, we've had JavaScript in some form since 2007, typically with the SharePoint services model. The newer REST-based services, web services, are what allow the rest of the world to allow the newer REST-based services will be familiar for interacting with the backend data in SharePoint to those not familiar with SharePoint. It complies mostly with OData 2.0 spec. So if you're used to querying data in REST services, you're probably using OData or some variant. You'll probably be familiar with that. The client-side object model, these are accelerators, typically as libraries. .NET is the most common library, I will say, used. You'll see this reference, in fact, many of the PowerShell scripts I write the first thing I'll load up is microsoft.sharepoint.client.dll, microsoft.sharepoint.client.runtime.dll. Those two DLLs give me a surface to interact with SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint Online. So the CSOM makes makes SharePoint accessible for .NET, PowerShell, anything else. There is a JavaScript version, JSOM, JavaScript object model. And that's what lets you use JavaScript to interact with SharePoint. SharePoint frameworks and other frameworks like React can be layered on top and consumed. React, you can build some very nice looking interfaces, interactive interfaces. Some of you may be familiar with Angular JS. That works. It's not as closely tied to SharePoint framework development, but you'll find plenty of examples from folks like Andrew Connell, who was using Angular JS before I think he got friendly with React. So we're going to be getting JavaScript-based solutions going forward, and this modern tooling stack is what makes it available to newer developers, younger developers, and what many of us will have to retool in. So even if you hate JavaScript, I want to point out that isn't your only option. You may not want to use the SharePoint framework. I know I tried doing some work in the SharePoint framework for a while, and I could not devote enough time to say get proficient in it. There were just too many nooks and crannies I would get lost in, and the tooling was too unfamiliar to me. And so, SharePoint framework, I can do some limited things, but I'm not a SharePoint framework expert by any measure. Older SharePoint developers tend to fare better with C# and ASP.NET. CSOM libraries, like I said, exist for .NET. We've got REST services. So like I said, you could use Java, PHP, Python, any connected platform with SharePoint. JavaScript snippets, jQuery, and simpler JavaScript approaches, they still exist and they still work. The script web part, you can drop in on a page. You can still write JavaScripts and deploy them straight into SharePoint sites. Even though those techniques work, they're not all that ALM friendly, and many of the pain points that would exist around, trying to keep track of versions, working with development teams, things like that, they still exist. Now, SharePoint framework addresses a lot of this, and it is integrated into a modern ALM approach. SharePoint framework also allows you, like I said, to use Reacts and other frameworks. Those of you who like TypeScript, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, and TypeScript makes JavaScript look and behave in a fashion that's more friendly to classical object-based developers who work in languages like C#. Now, it's worth noting that TypeScript transpiles to JavaScript. So you can go from TypeScript to JavaScript, but I still highly recommend some skill in JavaScript, because you cannot go from JavaScript to TypeScript. So unless you know how to interpret that JavaScript, knowing TypeScript isn't going to help you in certain scenarios, particularly browser-based debugging, things like that. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about citizen developer options at this point, but Power Apps and Power Automate are two very competent and powerful technologies we have at our disposal as well. And these tools firmly position themselves between developers and prosumers, or citizen developers. Power Automate is the idea of like stringing flow charts together, connecting steps, and having those steps do something, most often to replicate classical SharePoint workflows, because by and large, we don't recommend workflows anymore, even the 2013 ones. But people are writing old 2010 workflows in Flow to bring those back, into SharePoint Online, where they may be running now. Flow can go to on-premises lists with the right connectors. Power Apps, it is a technology at a minimum, it's a form-based or a UI-based generation tool, but also has plenty of code behind it. Todd Baginski is a really big Power Apps guy, and his company, Canvas with a Z at the end, he has been integrated with the Power Apps team for quite some time. His organization's been writing most of the demos and stacks for various various Power App events, the examples online, whatnot. There are plenty of Power Apps and Power Automate, what I'll term experts out there. I'm competent with both of them, but I do not consider them my domain of business. There are people who do these things better than I do, and they are very powerful tools in their own right. So the last part of this, don't paint yourself into a corner. Much of this is just, if we think about it, common sense. We'd like to think it's common. It's more like uncommon sense. Avoid the situation, avoid many of these missteps with some realistic and honest planning. Don't sit in a meeting saying, look, we're phasing system XYZ out in 6 months. Don't build anything that uses it. But I'm not going to say that because I'm not that person or that's not my system. You can help your organization avoid lots of problems if you have open and honest dialogue around these solution planning events. How long is your solution going to stay in operation? Are you going to migrate or shift from on-prem to the cloud? Can you minimize dependencies? The fewer dependencies you have, the greater your portability, typically with your solution. Can you reduce ongoing maintenance and changes over time so that you don't need to constantly hire developers to maintain your solution? Can lower tech approaches work? Sure, I can build a compiled C# application that runs on my desktop and gets at something, but maybe a simple script that runs without a user interface can do the same thing, or a SharePoint control. It might be easier and less development. So, or Power Automate, Power Apps. Those those approaches to many of these things work as well or sometimes better because we're not maintaining a lot of the plumbing and we don't have to. Microsoft does that for us. So these are some things you should think about. But all things being equal, if you have the ability to decide, choose a client-side strategy over a server-side strategy, because that is directionally where Microsoft is going. Opt for web standards and web services, open web standards and web services, like REST-based services. Don't go against proprietary APIs if you can help it. Microsoft is pushing the JavaScript development stack, the modern stack. So it stands to reason that SharePoint framework and associated technologies will probably have a longer life. It used to be possible to build only client-side web parts in SharePoint framework, but now we have extensions, SharePoint framework extensions that allow us to do more without necessarily a user interface. SharePoint framework continues to evolve, and I expect that pattern to continue. But at the end of the day, always follow Microsoft's development guidance and suggestions. There's an art to reading the tea leaves, but at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all solution approach. There are different directions you can go, different patterns. You do this long enough, you start to see those evolve. Technology choice in one scenario may be contraindicated in another. So you may think you have a situation that matches, situation XYZ that Bob had to do, but there's one small piece of technology that rules it out. Don't jump at the first sign of, I guess, a life raft. Make sure you research your problem domain and plan your solution accordingly. And that goes to the third point, a little extra effort seeking help and guidance from someone who's been building SharePoint solutions for a long time is worth the time and investment. And I've done this for organizations. I will consult and share my knowledge over the years, and directionally where somebody describes they need to be, I'll try to help them get there. Sometimes consultative, sometimes development wise. So if you want to get in touch with me, any of these mechanisms or routes is available. You can learn a little bit more about me at spmcdonough.com. My blog is sharepointinterface.com. Likewise, my email is sean@sharepointinterface.com. You can also do sean@bitstreamfoundry.com. And in Twitter, I'm spmcdonough. Early on, people thought that was SharePoint McDonough because a lot of people did SPs. I'm actually Sean Patrick. So I have official valid initials for SP McDonough. That's how to get a hold of me. Are there, thank you guys for coming. I've got, of course, resources out the wazoo at the end of this. Any final questions or thoughts anyone wants to raise? I know I probably missed some things that are critically important to some of you. I want to give everyone a chance to share that. If you'd rather do it privately, email works. Otherwise, if it's something you think everyone would benefit from, feel free to jump in.
Figure I give people a minute to ask questions.
To wake up.
No, I think this was super helpful. I thought it was really nice. It was a great overview of kind of where we've come from and where we're heading to. And I really appreciate that you posted on one of the slides, it actually said it depends, because I probably say that a lot and my clients hear that a lot. And sometimes I think that, sometimes it's that, do you really know kind of what?
Yeah, it's the answer I can give in every situation. And
yeah. Also, and of course, most things are possible with enough time and money, right?
Yeah, those two things.
So no, I thought it was really valuable. I really appreciate you coming and sharing this with us. I think it's it's a really good overview of, what's going on in SharePoint and in the development space in general for Microsoft. And I think it's really smart to keep up with things like JavaScript and, kind of heading that direction. I completely 100% agree that that's kind of the route we're headed.
Yeah, as painful as it is for the I used to, at the 2013 outset, I would give a talk called, oh God, what did I call that presentation? But it was new development techniques for grumpy old men or something like that. It was basically oriented at the folks coming who were going to be as shocked as I was in that meeting with Microsoft, being told they couldn't write compiled code anymore, and having to come to terms with this. I have to flush my skill set and go to something else. I mean, that was a very disturbing time for developers in SharePoint.
I think we're going through that again right now. I joke that, I spend just as much time doing therapy for development as anything else, just telling everybody it's going to be okay. And we've been here before and we'll get through it again. And, we've got a good long lifespan coming with what's coming. And so I think it'll be worth investing the time and effort.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. I hope that's the case. I really do.
Well, thanks again for your time. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to Sean afterwards or follow him on Twitter. Keep up with what he's doing. He does pop into Christian's community chats quite often. So if you have questions, I'm sure if you show up there, he'll be around to answer questions as well. Other than that, thanks to everybody for coming to our September user group, and we'll see you in October.